September 8th, from what I recall, was a clear, sunny, warm day. We received the call sometime in the early afternoon hours. When the trunk of the car was opened and the officers looked in to see the contents, they saw what appeared to be a partially dismembered and badly decomposed body.
11 air fresheners. That's the number prosecutors put on the screen inside a Los Angeles courtroom this week. 11. Tucked into a center console, wedged into door pockets, pushed into a front trunk that was never meant to hold anything more than a spare set of luggage. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that number matters and why the people sitting closest to the evidence photos couldn't bring themselves to keep watching. This is a real case still working its way through the courts. Nothing you're about to hear has been proven in a trial. The man at the center of it has pleaded not guilty, and everything described in testimony remains legally an allegation until a jury says otherwise. Let's get into it. If you've been following this story, you already know the broad strokes. A missing teenager, a pop star whose career was climbing fast, a discovery that stopped an entire fan base in its tracks. We're not going to walk back through all of that today. What we're focused on is one specific stretch of testimony from the second day of the preliminary hearing, the court session where prosecutors lay out enough evidence to convince a judge the case should go to trial. And on this particular day, the evidence on the table was the car. David Anthony Burke, the 21-year-old performer known to millions as D4vd, sat at the defense table as an LAPD criminalist walked the court through what investigators found when they processed his Tesla Model X. That's the vehicle's official designation, in case you're picturing something smaller. A Model X is Tesla's larger SUV, the one with the falcon wing doors that swing up instead of out, and, relevant to today's story, a front trunk. Electric cars don't need space up front for an engine block, so that area becomes extra storage. Owners call it a frunk. Most people use it for groceries or a stroller or gym bags. Investigators allege that Burke used his to store the remains of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Before we get into what was found inside, it helps to understand how this vehicle entered the investigation in the first place, because that sequence is part of what makes the air freshener count so significant once you hear it. According to what's been described in reporting around this case, the Tesla ended up at a tow yard, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable place where impounded or abandoned vehicles sit until someone claims them or they're processed for auction. Workers at that tow yard reported something that anyone who has ever caught a whiff of spoiled food in a hot car will recognize instantly, except far worse. A strong, persistent odor coming from the vehicle. Strong enough that it couldn't be ignored and unusual enough that it prompted a call rather than a shrug. That call is what eventually brought police to the car. When officers arrived and opened the front trunk, they found the remains inside 2 cadaver bags. That discovery happened the day after what would have been Celeste's 15th birthday. We're going to let that detail sit for a moment rather than rush past it, because it's the kind of fact that doesn't need embellishment to land. From there, the vehicle became evidence. It was towed again, this time by law enforcement, and transported to an LAPD forensic processing facility. The secure environment built specifically for this kind of examination. That's where the criminalist testimony picks up, and that's where the 11 air fresheners were first catalogued and photographed for the court. We're going to slow down here because this is where the testimony got specific, and specific is exactly what makes courtroom testimony different from headlines. Headlines give you the shock. Testimony gives you the sequence. The vehicle at the center of this case is one investigators describe as registered to Burke, and once it reached that forensic facility, criminalists in protective gear went over it inch by inch, cataloging everything that didn't belong, everything that might explain what happened, and everything that might tell a story the people involved never meant to tell. That's where the air fresheners come in. The criminalist who processed the car told the court she noticed something as soon as she started working through the interior. It wasn't one air freshener hanging from a rearview mirror, which is the kind of thing you'd expect in almost any car in Los Angeles. It was many. She began cataloguing them one by one, and by the time she finished, the count stood at 11 separate air fresheners scattered through the vehicle. Some were tucked into the center console, others were pushed into the pockets on the back doors, and more were found inside the frunk itself, the same compartment where investigators say Celeste's remains were ultimately located. Sit with that for a second, because it's worth sitting with. 11 is not a number that happens by accident. 1 air freshener is routine car maintenance. 2 or 3 might mean somebody really doesn't like the smell of fast food wrappers. 11, spread through nearly every storage space in the vehicle, starts to look like something else entirely. It starts to look like an effort. A repeated, deliberate effort to overpower a smell that kept coming back, no matter how many times someone tried to mask it. We're not going to tell you exactly what that effort means, because that's not our job. And frankly, it's not something this particular stretch of testimony settled either. What we can tell you is what investigators found when they opened that frunk, and what they said about the condition of the vehicle when they did. According to testimony, when officers eventually opened the front trunk, they found what they were looking for. Not luggage, not groceries. Celeste Rivas Hernandez's remains, contained inside 2 cadaver bags. That detail alone tells you something about the timeline here. Cadaver bags aren't something a family member or a bystander happens to have lying around. Their presence in that compartment points to a level of handling, of preparation, that investigators are still working to fully account for in court. Now here's where we have to be careful, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a story can drift from what was actually said into what feels true. Several reporters who were present for this testimony have floated the idea that the sheer number of air fresheners suggests the remains had been in that vehicle for an extended period, possibly months, and that the smell of decomposition became something the driver was actively, repeatedly trying to fight off. That is a reasonable inference. It lines up with common sense, but it is an inference, not sworn testimony. In this specific session, no medical examiner took the stand to put a number of days or weeks or months on how long those remains had been inside that car. What the court did hear directly from the criminalist on the stand was something arguably just as telling. She testified that the vehicle carried what she described, in her professional judgment, as an odor consistent, with a decomposing body, not a guess. Not a theory, a trained observation from someone whose job is built around identifying exactly that kind of thing. And she didn't stop there. She told the court about insect activity inside the frunk. Investigators photographed evidence of that activity directly around the area where the remains were found. A detail that, however uncomfortable to hear, is the kind of physical, documented fact that prosecutors use to build a timeline independent of anyone's memory or intention. Insects don't lie about how long they've been somewhere. That's precisely why this detail carries weight in a courtroom in a way that speculation never will. This is the part of forensic testimony that rarely makes it into casual conversation about a case like this. But it's worth understanding, because it explains why investigators spend so much time on details that might otherwise seem almost beside the point. Insects follow a predictable pattern once they reach a body. Certain species arrive first, drawn by scent alone, often within hours. They lay eggs. Those eggs progress through distinct, well-documented stages before becoming adult insects capable of flying off and starting the cycle again elsewhere. Forensic entomologists, specialists who study exactly this process, can look at which stage of that cycle is present in photographs and testimony, and use it to narrow down a window of time. We want to be precise here, because precision is the entire point of this video. No forensic entomologist testified during this specific portion of the hearing, and no exact time frame was placed on the record during this session. What was placed on the record was the observation itself, insect activity photographed inside the frunk, which is the kind of foundational evidence that this type of specialized analysis is often built on later in a case, whether during this hearing's later sessions or at trial. That distinction matters because it's easy, understandably, to hear insect activity and 11 air fresheners and jump straight to a conclusion about exactly how long something had been happening inside that car. Reporters covering the hearing have made that same jump in their own commentary, suggesting the volume of air fresheners points toward a much longer timeline than anyone initially assumed. It's a reasonable read of the physical evidence. But reasonable inference and sworn cited testimony are two different categories of information, and part of what separates careful coverage of an active criminal case from noise is keeping those categories distinct, even when they point in the same uncomfortable direction. So put those two things side by side. 11 air fresheners distributed almost everywhere a person could tuck one into that car. And a criminalist testifying under oath that despite all of them, the smell of decomposition still came through strong enough to be immediately recognizable to a trained professional. Whatever was being masked wasn't being successfully masked. Not for a professional's nose, and according to the timeline investigators have laid out, not forever. This is the point in the story where we need to talk about who else was in that courtroom. Celeste's parents, Celeste Rivas and Mercedes Martinez, have been present throughout this hearing. They've had the option, at multiple points, to step outside during the more difficult stretches of testimony. Court staff extended that option again during this portion. They chose to stay.
They're horrified. There was an image of Celeste's torso and her head in the trunk of the car, and the prosecutor had to ask what it was, because you could not tell it was a head. It was absolutely, it was deplorable.
And we will prove at that point, beyond a reasonable doubt, that David committed these three crimes. And when, and we do not predict if, when he is convicted, we will then be seeking the sentence that we are allowed to seek by order of the law, and we will let you know in a future date whether or not that sentence will also include the death penalty.
A reporter seated close to the family described the moment those air freshener photos went up on the courtroom screen. It wasn't dramatic in the way television makes courtroom moments dramatic. There was no outbursts, no raised voice. What was described instead was quieter and in some ways harder to watch. The parents seemed to draw inward, shoulders coming in, the space between them closing, as if instinct pulled them closer together the instant that image appeared. No one needed to explain to them what 11 air fresheners in a frunk might mean. They understood it before a single word of testimony connected the dots for the rest of the room. That's the cost of a hearing like this one that doesn't always make it into a headline. Every photograph entered into evidence, every clinical description from a criminalist doing their job lands somewhere. In this case, it landed on two parents who have already lived through the worst thing that can happen to a family, and who are now required to sit through a methodical, forensic accounting of exactly how it happened, one exhibit at a time. It's worth pausing to remember why any of this matters beyond the immediate horror of it. A preliminary hearing exists to answer one question. Is there enough evidence for this case to go to trial? It is not the trial itself. The judge overseeing these proceedings is not being asked to decide guilt or innocence. They're being asked whether prosecutors have laid out a case substantial enough to put in front of a jury. That's an important distinction, and it's one worth holding on to as more testimony comes out in the days ahead. Evidence shown in a preliminary hearing is real evidence, gathered by real investigators, but it exists in this specific setting to clear a legal threshold, not to serve as a final verdict. David Burke faces charges of murder, continuous sexual abuse of a minor, and mutilation of a body. Prosecutors have also brought special circumstances allegations in this case, the kind of additional legal findings that, if proven, can significantly increase the penalties a defendant faces at sentencing. Those allegations reportedly include lying in wait, committing murder for financial gain, and murdering a witness in an investigation, each one requiring its own standard of proof beyond the underlying charges themselves. Burke has pleaded not guilty to all of it, and his defense has maintained that he did not cause Celeste's death. It's worth remembering too that a preliminary hearing like this one typically unfolds over multiple days, with prosecutors calling a sequence of witnesses, each contributing a different piece of the picture. The vehicle testimony we've covered today is only one thread among several presented this week, alongside separate testimony about physical evidence recovered from the home where prosecutors allege the initial incident occurred, and testimony related to Burke's finances and career, which prosecutors have used to argue a possible motive. We've deliberately kept this video narrow, focused only on the vehicle and what was said about it, rather than folding in every thread from every witness. A case this complex deserves that kind of separation because collapsing everything into one narrative makes it harder, not easier, to understand what's actually been established at each stage. Those are the facts of where this case currently stands, separate from anything discussed in testimony about the vehicle. As this hearing continues, more evidence will likely be presented, more testimony will likely be heard, and we'll continue to bring you what's said in that courtroom as it happens, with the same care we've tried to bring to this video. What was actually testified to clearly separated from what's being inferred or assumed around it, because that distinction matters. It matters enough that we spent real time on it today, working through exactly what a criminalist said on the stand versus what reporters in that room reasonably speculated based on what they saw. Both have value, but only one of them is evidence a jury will eventually weigh, and it's worth all of us getting into the habit of telling the difference, especially in a case that has already generated so much noise, so much speculation, and so much heartbreak. Before we close, we want to bring this back to where it belongs, which is with Celeste herself. She was 14 years old. She had a name long before this case turned her into a headline, and she had a life that existed entirely outside of anything that happened to her in that vehicle. The forensic details we've walked through today, the air fresheners, the frunk, the insect activity, the odor a trained professional could still detect despite every apparent attempt to cover it, all of it exists in service of one goal: building a case that holds someone accountable for what was done to her. It is not the story of her life. It's only the story of how that life was taken, and how investigators are working, piece by piece, exhibit by exhibit, to prove exactly what happened. Her parents sat through testimony this week that no parent should ever have to sit through. They stayed in that room by choice, watching photograph after photograph, listening to clinical descriptions of the worst thing imaginable, because they wanted to be present for every step of whatever comes next. That's not a detail we're including for effect. It's a fact about who Celeste Rivas Hernandez was to the people who loved her and who they continue to be for her, even now. It's easy in coverage of a case like this for the person at the center of it to slowly disappear behind the evidence. The exhibits get numbers. The testimony gets clinical. The vehicle becomes a piece of forensic geography, catalogued compartment by compartment. And somewhere in that process, a 14-year-old girl can start to feel like a detail in someone else's story, instead of the reason the story exists at all. We don't want to do that here. Celeste was someone's daughter. She had people who showed up for her, who are still showing up for her in a courtroom, week after week, session after session, long after the headlines about her case have moved on to something else. That kind of presence doesn't get photographed for evidence, and it doesn't get read into the court record, but it's every bit as real as anything a criminalist testified to this week. If this case continues to develop, and it will, we'll keep covering it the way we've tried to today. Carefully, accurately, with the difference between testimony and speculation kept clearly in view, because Celeste deserves that, and so does everyone watching who's trying to actually understand what happened, rather than just consume another headline. This has been a look inside one day of testimony in an ongoing, unresolved criminal case. Nothing described here has been proven at trial. The defendant has pleaded not guilty, and under the law, he remains presumed innocent unless and until a jury finds otherwise. We'll continue following this case as it develops and bring you the next update as soon as there's something worth reporting. If you want to stay with this case as it moves forward, please subscribe to this channel and we'll see you in the next one.